Today we are looking at a case from the mid-19th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Jane Macmanamin was born in Ireland in 1833, and by the time she reached the age of 22, the world around her had already changed dramatically. In 1855, she and her sister Margaret, just 1 year younger, made the decision to leave their homeland and sail to South Australia. Theirs was not an unusual story, as the 1850s saw a wave of young Irish women migrating to Australia, driven by the harsh realities of life in post-famine Ireland, which had caused widespread poverty, starvation and despair. For young women like Jane and Margaret, opportunities were scarce, and the future seemed bleak. Meanwhile, across the seas, the colony of South Australia, with its wide open spaces and growing towns, was in desperate need of women in order to help with the labour shortages in both domestic service and rural industries, as well as to rectify the significant gender imbalance that had been caused by the earlier waves of predominantly male immigrants. Both sisters initially found employment with Leonard Lovegrove at the Poltalloch Station, a sprawling property situated on the shores of Lake Alexandrina. Jane worked there for over 2 years, before moving on to work for a gentleman named William Carter in the nearby town of Wellington. Mr. Carter served as both postmaster and ferry keeper and played a key role in the town, which was an important ferry crossing point for people, livestock and goods travelling overland between Adelaide and Melbourne. Jane developed a close bond with Mr. Carter. She entrusted him with her savings, £50, a significant amount at the time, and also with a few of her personal possessions, some of which held great emotional value to her. However, Jane did have a reputation for her frugality and careful money management, and this was often commented upon by those who knew her. Around 1857, Jane left the employment of Mr. Carter and took a job working for Mrs. Catherine Robinson, the owner of an inn called the Traveller's Rest in Salt Creek, a small settlement along the Coorong, about 66 miles from Wellington. Mrs. Robinson was a widow, her husband having died under mysterious circumstances in June 1856. A local man named Malachi Martin was apprehended as a suspect. He was someone with a checkered past. He had been born in Ireland in 1831, but in 1837, when he was just 6 years old, he travelled along with his parents to South Australia, eventually settling in a district just south of Adelaide. And when he was a teenager, he was charged with theft while working in a post office in Encounter Bay. He was tried, but found not guilty. However, just 6 days later, tragedy struck his family when his mother drowned in a pond near to their house. At the subsequent inquest, it was ruled that she had taken her own life while labouring under temporary insanity, likely caused by the emotional toll of her son's criminal trial. To compound the tragedy, she was heavily pregnant at the time. There were some locals, however, who questioned this verdict. A few years later, Malachi Martin and his father moved to a farm near the Coorong. He worked there and also drove the mail coach between Adelaide and Melbourne. Salt Creek was a stopping point, and he became acquainted with William and Catherine Robinson. However, as he stopped there more often, rumours circulated that he and Catherine were involved in an improper relationship. Mr. Robinson was not fond of Mr. Martin, although he welcomed his custom. In June 1856, the two men went into the bush together in search of scrub cattle, but only Malachi Martin returned. A search party was organised to find Mr. Robinson, with Mr. Martin assisting. Shortly after, Mr. Robinson's body was discovered near the edge of a swamp. His throat had been slashed. He was found lying face down with a knife in his right hand, in spite of the fact that Mr. Robinson was left-handed. Although Malachi Martin was a suspect in the murder, the case against him was soon dropped. He then left the region and went to live in Sydney. He stayed there for 2 years, but returned in 1858, where in a surprising turn of events, he and Catherine Robinson married in June of the same year. This only increased the speculation regarding the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Robinson's husband's death. Life had somewhat changed for Jane. She was no longer working for Mrs. Catherine Robinson, who following her second marriage was now Mrs. Catherine Martin. It seemed to Jane that Mrs. Martin's husband Malachi was the one in charge of the inn. Jane found him to be a brutish type of character, aggressive and selfish, with little concern for anyone but himself. His words were often blunt, and his actions reflected his disregard for how they affected others. However, despite his outward demeanour, there were moments when she glimpsed something deeper, perhaps a hint of sadness or regret hidden beneath his tough exterior. Jane's weekly wage was 11 shillings, with food and accommodation included. Due to this, and the rural environment where she lived, she found little need for day-to-day spending. As a result, she rarely took the money she earned for her hard work, and instead asked Mr. Martin to look after it for her. He was happy to do this, and assured her that the money was safe with him, and that he would give it to her whenever she was in need of it. Over time, her earnings quietly accumulated, but Jane, with simple needs and frugal habits, rarely gave the matter much thought. It seemed to be an arrangement that suited them both. She frequently wrote to her sister Margaret, sharing news and updates. However, in February 1862, the letters suddenly stopped. By April, Margaret had grown increasingly anxious. She'd always worried about Jane and had harboured doubts about Mr. Malachi Martin. She knew from the letters that her sister had not been particularly fond of him, and now, troubled by Jane's silence and not knowing what to do, Margaret contacted Mr. William Carter, who was her sister's previous employer, and confided in him her concerns about Jane's well-being. Mr. Carter immediately began making inquiries about her whereabouts, speaking with anyone who he thought might have seen or heard from Jane. However, despite his best efforts, there was no trace of the young lady. He then decided to contact the police. Officer William Rollinson from the Wellington police station was assigned to lead the investigation. At first, he approached the case as a routine missing persons inquiry, hoping that Jane had simply gone off on her own for a while. He spoke to Mr. Malachi Martin, the innkeeper, but he just told Mr. Rollinson that she had not simply vanished, and that there was nothing mysterious about her absence. He claimed that back in February, a group of Jane's friends had stopped at the Traveller's Rest. While heading south, he claimed that Jane had decided on the spur of the moment to join them, at least as far as Maria Creek, a stop along their routes. He said that she had told him that once there, she had planned to continue to her sister's residence on foot, which was apparently nearby. Malachi Martin's story, though simple and reassuring on the surface, did little to quell the unease of William Rollinson and his fellow officers. The timeline that Mr. Martin had provided seemed vague, and no one could confirm having seen Jane since that day. Her friends, whom Mr. Martin had mentioned, had not been identified, and the route she supposedly took was long and isolated. In fact, his explanation raised more questions than answers. As weeks passed, the police grew more convinced that something far more sinister had taken place. Doubts about Malachi Martin's accounts deepened, and officers began to suspect that Jane had never in fact left the inn that day. Their focus shifted from a simple disappearance to uncovering the dark truth that might lie within the walls of the Traveller's Rest. When they searched the inn, they found Jane's knitting discarded in the kitchen and a pair of her shoes in the room she used to occupy. They also discovered that Mrs. Catherine Martin was wearing 2 rings that are identified to have belonged to Jane. By late May, Officer Rollinson's suspicions about Mr. Martin had grown significantly, prompting him to take the unusual step of deploying an undercover officer at the inn. Disguised as a guest, the officer's mission was to discreetly observe Mr. and Mrs. Martin and any other patrons, in the hope of uncovering any clues as to what had happened to Miss Jane Macmanamin. However, despite the officer's efforts, an unsettling silence surrounded the case. No one spoke of Jane, and any attempt to gather information seemed to lead to dead ends. This only deepened the mystery into the young lady's disappearance. On the 29th of May, a native Australian known as Mickey brought alarming news to William Allen, a resident of Wood Wells, a secluded place located about 11 miles north of Salt Creek. Mickey informed Mr. Allen that the body of a young woman had been found by someone he knew. It had been concealed and partially buried in a wombat hole, approximately half a mile from the Traveller's Rest. Upon learning of this grim discovery, Mr. Allen acted quickly and sent an urgent message to the nearest police station. This was received by a police trooper, who immediately relayed the information to his superiors at police headquarters. However, recognising the seriousness of the situation, the police trooper also saddled his horse and rode to Wellington, personally informed Senior Officer Rollinson about the discovery. Soon police arrived at the place where the body was found and exhumed it from its makeshift grave, carefully transporting it to Woodwells for an official inquest. This was held on the 2nd of June, and the body was soon identified to be the missing young woman, Miss Jane Macmanamin. William Allen, who had first received the news from Mickey, took it upon himself to make a coffin for Jane. He then buried her on top of a hill, about 200 metres from his house. However, the Crown Solicitor, recognising the need for thoroughness in such a serious case, ordered that the body be disinterred for further examination, as it was deemed essential that a qualified medical expert should conduct a thorough autopsy and establish the exact cause of death. Dr. Goss, a respected physician, was summoned from Adelaide specifically for this purpose. After a careful and methodical examination, he announced that Jane Macmanamin had died due to strangulation. The evidence now pointed in the direction of Malachi Martin, making him the prime suspect. He was the last person to have seen the young lady alive. The proximity of his home to the body's burial site was unmistakable, and his claim that Jane had left with friends had never been seen as credible. The inquest concluded that Malachi Martin should face trial on the charge of willful murder. The case drew considerable public and press attention. It was not only a tale of violence, but also one of betrayal, deceit, and the painstaking efforts to bring justice to a remote corner of the country. The trial was due to begin on the 20th of August 1862. A key witness in the case was William Wilson, a carpenter who, along with Jane, had often worked for Malachi Martin at the Traveller's Rest. Mr. Wilson had initially told police that on the day Jane vanished, Mr. Martin had sent him on an errand to a station about 20 miles from Salt Creek. However, while en route to Adelaide to testify at the trial, Mr. Wilson stopped in Wellington. There, after a night of heavy drinking, he told the publican, Mr. William Butcher, that he had seen Jane's dead body in Salt Creek. His statement caused quite a stir and directly contradicted his earlier testimony that he had no knowledge of her fate. When the authorities were informed of his drunken confession, they became suspicious, as it implied that he may have been more involved in Jane's disappearance than initially thought. Mr. Wilson was then arrested as an accessory to the crime, which led to the postponement of the trial and further heightened uncertainty surrounding the case. His arrest cast new doubts on his involvement in Jane's disappearance, complicating the investigation even more. The delay, coupled with shifting suspicions, only deepened the confusion over the true circumstances of Jane's fate. While in prison, Mr. Wilson made yet another startling claim. He revealed that shortly before Jane's disappearance, he had proposed to her, and she had accepted. He went on to say that the only person who he had shared this information with was Malachi Martin. It was uncertain as to whether in this confession Mr. Wilson was telling the truth, or it was just yet another fabrication, but it added even more complexity to his already dubious credibility. The trial finally commenced on the 2nd of December 1862, with both men pleading not guilty. If William Wilson's claims were true, it suggested that Mr. Martin might have killed Jane to avoid paying her 2 years' wages. However, Mr. Wilson was considered by most to be an unreliable person. One witness, named Peter Nichols, who drove the mail coach between Adelaide and Melbourne, told the court that he had seen Jane at the inn on the 2nd of February and that she seemed to be in good spirits. He said that 6 days later, on his return, he passed William Wilson about a quarter of a mile along the road from the inn. He added that when he arrived at the Traveller's Rest, he knocked on the door, but no one answered. Then, after some delay, Mr. Martin opened up and let him in. He said that Mrs. Martin was not present, so he assisted Malachi in preparing the evening meal, and that later they were joined by a man named Mr. Stockdale, and the three of them ate together. He went on to say that during the meal, Mr. Martin informed him that Jane had left his employment, claiming that she had run away in a covered wagon that was heading towards Mount Gambier. What Mr. Nichols said next caused a deep sense of unease to settle over the courts. He recalled that on his way to the Traveller's Rest, he had seen a covered wagon at the Rankine station, which was located between Salt Creek and Mount Gambier. He had spoken with the people in the wagon, but he neither saw Jane nor heard any mention of her. He also expressed confusion over Mr. Martin's claim that Jane had just suddenly gone off. He said that he had known her for 2 years and knew that Mr. Martin owed her more than £50 in wages. He said that in his opinion, it made no sense that she would just leave, and he thought that if she had just gone anywhere, it would have been to see Mr. Carter to collect the remainder of her money, especially as some of her friends worked for him. When William Wilson gave evidence, he told the court that on the day Jane disappeared, he had gone to Stephen Hack's station to get a saddle, and upon his return, he was informed that Jane had left with friends for Mount Gambier. He said that initially he wasn't suspicious, as Jane had sometimes mentioned going there for the higher wages available. The court then fell silent when Mr. Wilson said that he had seen Jane's body after her death. He explained that Malachi Martin later confessed to him that he had killed her and then threatened to finish him off if he said anything. He had kept this information to himself until he finally confided in Mr. Butcher, the publican at Wellington. Mr. Carter was another witness. He informed the court that shortly before her death, Jane had told him that she had £70 in savings, which was being looked after by Mr. Martin. He added that he knew that she was contemplating returning to Ireland and wanted to take the money back with her. Malachi Martin chose not to testify and instead maintained his story that Jane had left impulsively with friends, despite her promising not to depart before his wife Catherine had returned. When the trial ended, he was found guilty for Jane's murder and was subsequently sentenced to death. William Wilson was found guilty of an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 4 years hard labour. Malachi Martin was hanged at Adelaide Jail on the 24th of December 1862. Before his execution, he made only one statement. He said that William Wilson had never seen Jane's body at Salt Creek and that he had made the whole thing up. Following the hanging, he was buried within the jail grounds. After the authorities had conducted the autopsy on Jane's body, she had again been buried at Woodwells, the place where William Allen had originally laid her to rest. In the 1920s, there were reports of a jam tin marking her grave, and later, a stone cairn was erected. Sadly, however, by the mid-20th century, the exact location of the grave had been forgotten. Fortunately, it was rediscovered in 1966 by a government surveyor and 2 local men named Alan Johnson and Arthur Reed, who confirmed the actual location where Jane had been buried by digging until they found her bones. In 1972, a concrete headstone was then placed at the burial sites and a memorial service was held. Although the grave is on private property, the fenced area can still be seen from the highway by anyone who passes through Woodwells. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.